Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining the session, Closing the Divide, Teaching and Assessing What Really Matters. Before we start, I'd like to share some housekeeping info with you, please. The session will be recorded and the link will be shared post-webinar. Please avoid using AI note takers where possible, as automatic messages can be distracting. Please use the Q&A button at the top of your screen for any questions you may have, and please upvote questions of interest to you so that we can prioritize. 2 polls will be launched during the webinar. These will appear on screen for your response. Please access through the chat if you have joined via a web browser. Attendance certificates will be available on completion of the feedback survey. The survey link will be shared in the chat at the end of the session, I'm sorry. So thank you so much for joining us today. I know you've joined from around the world, and I just read in the chat somebody's joined from Mexico and other parts of South America at 6 a.m. We really appreciate, really. So thank you for coming. In the previous session, Lost in Translation, what do we mean? What do we mean by workplace communication? We explored how the term workplace communication is interpreted differently by academia, higher education, and industry. One key insight from the discussion was everybody agrees workplace communication is important, but how it should be developed, demonstrated, and assessed, no agreement there. In today's discussion takes that conversation a step forward by focusing on assessment. Assessment has profound implications on graduates entering the workforce. Research suggests 60 to 70% graduates' struggles stem from misalignment between how these skills are assessed at university and during recruitment. Today, we bring together assessment expertise, higher education, and employer insight to figure what the gap is, if there is any, and if it can be closed. Our discussion today will unfold in 3 interconnected parts. First, we will establish the current landscape. That is how each sector assesses communication skills or communication. Then we will examine where meaningful gaps emerge and what dimensions of communicative competence we might be missing. Finally, we will explore concrete strategies for alignment, including the role of frameworks, authentic assessment, and cross-sector collaboration. Throughout, we will invite your questions and perspectives. As I said, you've joined from an audience from around the world. We would like to hear your ideas about the discussion. Please feel free to contribute in the chat. As far as framing the context, across higher education, communication skills are evaluated through written exams, coursework, presentations, project work, and other academic tasks. Whereas in employment contexts, communication is commonly judged through interviews, group discussions, aptitude tests, and sometimes even employability tests, and ultimately through workplace performance. These are not necessarily incompatible approaches, but they often capture different dimensions or constructs of communicative competence. As a result, what graduates might perceive as effective is not necessarily what employers are looking for. At the same time, we have shared frameworks such as the CEFR and other standardized measures which help us describe communicative ability, but how these may be applied. These frameworks may be interpreted and applied are applied vary. So today we explore the central question: to what extent do our current assessment practices really capture communication skills graduates need in professional contexts? If there are gaps, how might higher education, academia, and assessment research and employers work together to close them? To these questions, we are joined by our panel, bringing perspectives from assessment research, higher education, and industry. Without much ado, let me introduce our esteemed panel with you. Richard, Jyotsna, and Ritmi, if could you please, say hello to the audience and introduce yourselves. Let's start with Richard.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Richard Spivey and I'm the Head of Assessment Research at the British Council.
Jyotsna?
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Jyotsna. I lead learning and development for the NatRes Group in India. I'm very excited about this particular event because I work very closely with businesses in early careers, and communication seems to be one of those skills that keep coming up quite often. And it would be lovely to understand how it's recognized and how it's assessed, right from education to employment. So I'm very excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Ritmi, please.
Hi everyone. Hi from Sri Lanka. So I'm Ritmi Handapanguda, and I currently work as a lecturer in language and linguistics at the Department of CEFR, University of Colombo here in Sri Lanka.
Thank you. So before we explore where misalignment may occur, it is helpful to understand what the landscape is like right now. In higher education, communication is often evaluated through a range of academic tasks, such as written assignments, presentations, written theory-based exams on communication skills. Whereas in recruitment, communication skill is frequently assessed through interviews, group discussions, and sometimes employability tests. These approaches reflect different purposes and constraints and capture different constructs of communicative competence. So I would like to ask my panel, in your sector, and this is for everybody, Richard, Jyotsna, and Ritmi, in your sector, how do you operationalize communicative competence? And what dimensions matter the most and why? Let's start with Jyotsna.
So basically in the workplace, communication is assessed more based on impact rather than the actual language or the structure of the language. We're looking at how people perform in real life situations. Are they able to influence people, for example, right? Because as a team leader, you might have to play different roles. As a manager, you may have to manage teams and things like that. So how do they do that? How do they work under pressure? How are they able to understand and probably read the room? How are they able to bring the right kind of words to use from I think it's more social-linguistic competence and strategic competence that we're looking at in our sector more than the others. So we're not looking at perfect English, but we're looking at effective communication, if I may say that. So those are the things that are ideally assessed in the workplace, more behavior related to from a communication perspective.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Ritmi?
Yes, of course. So from a higher education perspective, let me be very honest with this. So actually, I think communication competence has traditionally been, understood through quite an academic lens. So we often operationalize it through, students' ability to demonstrate understanding clearly, structure ideas logically, coherently, and also use language accurately, and also communicate appropriately within disciplinary conventions, actually. So it means we tend to assume, as Cumming said previously, so then of course we tend to, use assessment methods such as, exams and written, assignments and group-based or individual presentations, just like those. There are specific constraints, real constraints within universities. So those are the underlying, reasons behind using these kind of communication assessment. For example, we are having large cohorts with, hundreds of students. So, and of course, we have to focus on standardization. I mean, standardized grading systems. There, of course, we have to stay focused, regarding, high stake tests. Otherwise, we can't, practically assess students. I'm not like trying to, justify what we are doing at the university. Maybe, I'm coming from a global South background, so maybe, you have different types of perspectives and, experiences. I'd love to hear from you in the chat regarding those as well, if that is the case.
Thank you. Richard.
Well, the simple answer for me is that as an assessment researcher and as a test developer as well, that I have to look at everything. So, but traditionally we've always looked at linguistic competence. So grammar and vocabulary, getting things right, being accurate, have traditionally been kind of the most important thing. But we are much more aware these days of other kinds of competence as well. So as Josna said about the, pragmatic, competence, trying to achieve your goals, sociolinguistic competence, trying to, behave appropriately and, not to make big mistakes and offend people, which brings us to things like cultural competence as well, which is maybe not quite in our zone. Maybe that's a slightly different area, but that's also like hugely important. And probably one thing that we might talk a bit about today is interactional competence. So how do people behave when they're actually talking to people? The problem for us is that that's quite difficult to measure. So it's we're learning a lot more about it at the moment, but it's still being sort of researched. So, I mean, when we look at context, so I do, tests for academic purposes and also for the workplace as well. And, for us, it's about looking at the needs, doing a needs analysis, seeing what skills are needed, and looking at the, the purpose of the assessment. Why are we testing people? What's going to happen to them if they pass, if they fail? What decisions are we going to make about them to make sure that, the assessment is as appropriate as possible as well?
So what I'm getting is, Josna said, we want to check during recruitment stage if they can influence people, because of course they must be talking to clients and you have to get business and those kind of things come into play. And with the constraints in higher education, large, number of students in a class, how Ridmi talked about it was slightly different. On the other hand, Richard, you said, do a needs analysis. We want to know what is the assessment going to be used for? What are the consequences of the result? How will it be used meaningfully or not? So as a test developer, you are looking at what the needs are, which would be higher education. How will the test be used for? That would be during employment. So you're considering both aspects, both the university side and the industry side. Now, my question for both Ridmi and Jyotsna is, in your experience, knowledge, does higher education and the industry talk to each other so that they are on the same page and the assessment is aligned and graduates don't face a problem? Because different excellent communication skills mean different things to different people, as we established in the last session. So that's for Jyotsna and Ridmi.
So I can go first.
Yeah.
So I think they talk to each other because we're looking at the same competence, which is communication, right? And having a baseline in terms of where everybody stands at, like a CEFR, or in terms of language and grammar, is a good thing. So from that aspect, they probably talk to each other. However, what is being assessed in these two different areas or sectors are very different, although the competence is the same. So I think that's where the misalignment is in terms of understanding what is required in the workplace versus what's actually happening in the education universities. So that's where I think the challenge is. And sorry, what was your second question, Kamini?
I mean, are people, is the industry and higher education talking to each other so that assessments are aligned? You know, you say that we are measuring the same thing. I slightly disagree with you, because how recruitment tests, English tests are different from what comes into play at university.
So what's happening is right now, I think we are changing. Earlier, it used to be a grammar test right at the beginning. And then if they're good at vocabulary and pronunciation and subject verb agreement, they're in, right? However, right now, that's really not the need in a workplace. I mean, that is important. Like I said, we can't say no to that, but we also need them to be able to influence, react to different contexts and scenarios and things like that. So what is changing right now is even during the recruitment, we're trying to bring in aspects of both together. So you probably would start with an English grammar assessment initially, and then go on to scenario-based recruitment, where we're looking at simulations and things like that, or giving them a scenario and say behavioral indicators, right? What would you do in a situation like this, and see how they're expressing that. So that is where we're moving towards. So I guess from that aspect, we are kind of slowly beginning to get there from a workplace perspective.
And Ridmi, do you, I mean, when on-campus recruitment happens, a lot of companies come on campus. So do you have any experience of talking to them, and what insight? I mean, does that insight then feed into what you do in the classroom?
Yes, actually, in other university context, we are trying to, revising, reviewing our curriculum these days, just to align with the, workplace communication, workplace assessment in terms of communicative skills. Because at this point, I have to say no, very honestly, because here, of course, we are just, using, written exams and, presentations, mostly individual presentations, and sometimes even the group-based discussions are, happening, but those are even structured and under controlled, and students are getting more preparatory time to get ready and rehearse. So but when it comes to, as Jasna said, when it comes to workplace communication, it is not the same like in our university-based assessment. So we have to change. So we are trying to getting closer towards getting integrated, particularly social linguistic and strategic communicative abilities into our curriculum, then through that towards the assessment. I mean, we are trying to be authentic while trying to be feasible and at the same time valid. So that's why we are trying to do this.
Okay. So the sense that I'm getting is that the differences do exist at the moment, and alignment has, the gap, there is an effort to close that gap. When actually that can be bridged and how much it can be bridged remains to be seen. At the same time, I would also like to ask the audience, which dimension of communication do you think is the most underassessed in workplace assessment in higher education and recruitment? You'll just see the poll on your screen. It'll be great if you could respond to that. Okay, so Richard, this one's for you. When you design let's say, a workplace communication assessment, what aspects of real world communication are you prioritizing, and what is the trade-off? Because again, I know that it will be very, very industry specific, but if we were to take, let's say, a test that could work for more than one industry, let's say? So what, I mean, how would that work?
Generally, we would approach that by concentrating more on production and interaction.
Okay.
So our understanding, Jyotsna, you can tell us more about it, but interaction is incredibly important, and it's about how people act and respond in real time. So in real situations where they're having to deal with, they're in a meeting, they're talking to a client or something like that, and how they actually respond spontaneously is kind of very, very important. Whereas, in more kind of like academic based assessments, that wouldn't be, especially important for us. But in the workplace, doing that and integrating the skills as well. So, you may be reading something, reporting something to somebody, but also listening and responding to them by speaking as well. So all of this idea that you're doing a writing exam or a speaking exam or a listening exam is or a grammar exam, just kind of doesn't kind of really work so much. And actually we need to put all of those together to look at the kind of the real
make
communication.
So that it reflects how it actually how it happens in the workplace.
Yeah.
So more authentic assessment than, okay, it's a speaking test and you're asked to speak for 2 minutes on anything. I don't think that
Exactly.
that would work. Okay, so even the audience, clearly states that strategic and sociolinguistic competence is the most under-assessed. And as Jyotsna confirms, that those are the kind of things the employer is looking for. And that's very, very clear. Actually, I would say everything is important. You wouldn't say these two are more important than the other. I think all works in unison, and you can't be effective without not having all of these different types of competencies, really. So we're beginning to see that different dimensions or constructs are emphasized in higher education at university. And of course, as an assessment developer, it's a different ballgame altogether. In our next part of the discussion, we will look more closely at where these differences begin to matter. So we know that, as we just said, communication skills are assessed differently. University did me confirm there are lots of constraints, large cohorts, completing the syllabus, and employers want a quick recruitment exercise because the longer it goes, the more money, it really, really costs. So what emerges is that, are we measuring the same underlying ability or different manifestations of communication? Let's explore this a little bit and see where it all diverges. Because there is difference, the first question is, this is for Ridmi and Jyotsna, does the difference in assessment method, purpose, and evidence actually create misalignment? Or does it simply reveal differences in what each sector genuinely needs? So how can then this work? Because everybody's assessing different things. University result, students got 93 on 100, probably won't mean much to an employer. So what is happening? Why is there this misalignment? Ridmi, you can go first.
Yeah,
Or Jyotsna.
of course, I do. So I think it is partly both. I mean, the misalignment is carried, created actually by assessment methods, purposes, and evidence. But at the same time, those differences also, reveal that higher education and workplace genuinely, reflect somewhat different forms of, communication. So universities and, employers are like, operating in very, different environments with very different responsibilities, actually. So universities are, expected to, like, as I previously said, assess learning, fairly, constantly, and, at scales. So naturally, assessment often, focuses on communication that can be, observed, standardized, or somewhat, justified academically, actually. So that usually meant, by, written assessments, presentations, structured discussions, and, like kind of, communication, forms of communication which are actually structured and preparatory. But when it comes to employers, however, they don't ask whether the person or the candidate can, communicate well in academic settings. Instead, they are asking, as Jyoska said, they're asking, can this person function effectively within, our professional setting? That is the most important thing. So there, of course, I have to say, yes, the assessment methods themselves, contribute to the misalignment, because they privilege different performances of, communication. So, I mean, competence, actually. But I also think at the same time, we can't simply say that, universities are doing an incorrect job, a wrong
You can't
job.
say
And
that.
of course,
No,
and of course,
we are not saying that.
of course, and also actually, and even they have different purposes, of assessment. And even when it comes to employers, they also have different purposes. So they are measuring communication for different purposes. That makes it makes that misalignment. So
Okay.
yes, it is the reason behind that misalignment. So if the gap, simply a kind of a technical problem of assessment design, I mean, then we can simply, go straight forward and, fill that with kind of a shared type of assessment framework. But we can't be that straightforward, because communication is deeply contextual. It is contingent, I mean. So what counts as effective in one context does not count as effective in another context. There where we have to bridge this gap by being, when it comes to universities, we have to be authentic while, preserving fairness and validity. And even the employers, they should, articulate what exactly they mean by good communication. Then of course we can produce more kind of effective assessments,
So
focusing on that.
So could employers be, Josna, this is for you, could employers be a little more explicit about what they want from the candidate in the job advert, rather than saying we need excellent or good communication skills? And why does that not happen? And sometimes I've seen, I don't think, usually it is listed that what level of CFR would be good for that level. Again, that doesn't make its way into the job advert. So do you think that would be helpful in bridging the gap?
So in some organizations, I've definitely seen very clear constructs of what is required from that particular job in terms of a job description, right? I probably in adverts that come in newspapers and things like that, or where it's very public. I mean, if I can say that, there's probably not that much of information except saying we need strong communication skills. They don't really talk about influencing or being empathetic or reading the room and things like that, right? While what I have seen within organizations, when they kind of put up stuff on the career website or when it's done internally as an internal job application, I have seen descriptors very clearly saying what exactly is required, to the extent of saying you will have to talk to different stakeholders, so you should be able to communicate with them clearly, understand what is expected
This is
out of you in your
internal.
role.
This is internal.
Yeah.
Not external.
Yeah, it doesn't come out as much. Yeah. I guess, I don't think everybody measures from a CEFR aspect as well, because I don't know how many people even realize that something like that exists unless you're part of the industry or you've done that, right? So probably that's another reason. We could definitely think about this in terms of, but there are career websites of different organizations that I've seen where in the JD, again, it's very clearly mentioned in terms of what is expected of you. And I think as a candidate applying for a job, when you go through it, you also try and read between lines in terms of saying, if they expect you to, say, interact with stakeholders and manage this, what kind of skill would I need to be able to do that? And then communication comes into play very importantly. And then what aspects of communication? But I don't know if everybody reads adverts like that too, right? I mean, nobody wants to go in depth in terms of what each one of them states. So I guess that's also something that we could work on and tell people, read more, understand the description more, or contact the employer and understand the role better. I probably suggest that for now.
Okay, let's also ask the audience, in their opinion, which current assessment approach best predicts how someone will actually communicate in the workplace? Let's look at that poll and let's see what the audience has to say. Richard, meanwhile, some employers use behavioral assessment tools. Some rely on, like employability tests are there, which check aptitude, verbal ability, a whole lot of different things. And some employers rely on interviews, interview impressions, while some, it's okay, there's a group discussion happening and we are just observing and they make up their mind if the candidate has English ability or not. From an assessment research lens, how valid are these approaches? And again, are different things being assessed in an interview, maybe in a presentation, in a group discussion, or any other means that they use?
Well, yes, I think is the answer to that. So we have kind of overlapping skills, but whichever method you use, you're going to find out something different. Yeah. So interviews, I've been on both sides of interviews myself personally, as an interviewee and an interviewer. I personally quite like interviews, but they are not always a good predictor of workplace performance. You might learn quite a lot about kind of basic communication skills and about interview skills. Some people are actually very good at interviews, some people not so good, but that doesn't reflect on, what happens to them afterwards. So, you can often reject people who are having a bad day, or who are not naturally confident, shall we say, because a lot of interviews is about confidence and how you project yourself. And confidence, obviously, in business is important because you want to come across as confident to people. So that's kind of part of our construct, part of what we're assessing. But people can react very differently in those situations. So that's one kind of quite specific thing. Aptitude tests or performance tests. You can give somebody a task to do and just say, okay, you've got 30 minutes, here's a task, and then, come and tell us about it. Those are generally quite kind of valid, I would say, because they are more closely aligned to kind of workplace skills. And also they can be made quite context specific. So obviously, according to the job, according to the company, those are adaptable. Sometimes have to be a little bit careful about accessibility with that. So, You know, are you giving people tasks that rely on certain assumptions or understandings about the kind of culture or the culture of a particular workplace? So whichever method you choose, you're going to get a part of the picture. And obviously, we would always recommend that you look at different sources of information and that you might have an interview with a task as well, a performance task, and maybe something else as well, an aptitude test as well. And that's going to give you different information. So those things, yeah, they're overlapping, but no single method is going to give you, you know, the overall picture. And we just have to be careful that we understand those limitations.
Yes, because I mean, the audience just said that, you know, the best predictor of communicative ability is on-job performance. 57% of the audience said that. So I guess, okay, but to get to that, to be able to get that job, and then after 6 months, the employer realizes, okay, they have the skills, they have to, there's gatekeeping that happens. And
or we
that
made a mistake, we hired the wrong person.
So
it's like you're 6 months in the job, it's too late, you know.
Too late, yes. So there's no consensus really, because everybody's context is different, industry is different, what they want to see in terms of communicative ability, of course, varies. So again, we are measuring a different construct. Everyone is measuring a different construct of communicative competence. And I guess you'll agree there's no right or wrong here. Do what works best for your situation, your context, for the employer, for the university. And then I wonder, how can an alignment be achieved? Because it's so hard then for the graduates, because they are getting mixed signals from university for what, you know, how it works, employer. And again, they would be interested in 3 different jobs. Okay, let's say same job in 3 different organizations, but they would want different things from the same person for the same job, because organizational context also decides how you operate and what the culture is, as you mentioned earlier. Okay, thank you. So we've looked at what the landscape is. We've looked at, there's no consensus in terms of it's hard. Okay, we figure that it'll be hard to, you know, get one standardized test which can work for everyone in every situation. That would be difficult. And that's where the gap is. Now let's look at how these perspectives may be brought together, or maybe some kind of complementary approaches that might work. Okay, so imagine, this is what Jyotsna entered me. Imagine you're designing a university assessment that would genuinely prepare students for the kinds of communication employers value, which is interactive, it's authentic, and all of that. What would that assessment look like given constraints that you have of large cohorts, diverse proficiency levels, and maybe a score? I mean, I know this is a difficult question. I'm just asking you to be a little imaginative and say what do you think can work?
Okay, shall I begin?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I think the assessment would need to, you know, when it comes to university, so assessment would need to move closer to authentic communication rather than, you know, fully, you know, based on prepared performance. So that does, you know, that does not mean abandoning academic, you know, rigor, but creating tasks where the students must communicate dynamically, collaboratively, and you know, under some degree of, you know, unpredictability, uncertainty, right? So, for example, instead of assessing communication only through an individual presentation. We could design a kind of a scenario-based group task. Student might be, given kind of workplace, related problem, such as, responding to a dissatisfied client, managing a team disagreement, or, proposing a kind of a solution to a real kind of community issue, let's say so, for the moment. So, they would be then, of course, they would be, they should discuss, negotiate and adapt their ideas, and also they have to then respond to, questions, and also arrive at decisions in real time. I mean, what we would then, assess is not only linguistic competence, then of course even, interactional ability. So it means how students manage turn taking, how they are responding to, each other's questions, and also clarifying, and also managing with disagreements, and also collaborating, and kind of cross, kind of the communication across differences, and also strategically communicate under pressure. Okay. But there's another problem with our constraints. So let me be very realistic with that. If we were to, respond to that, we have to diversify the approaches. Instead of having one high-stake exam at the end of the term or the semester, we can think of having multiple, assessment, and also multiplying the assessment methods. For example, we can have kind of, rubrics for interactive tasks, and peer assessment, and also smaller simulation tasks. Likewise, we can, diversify the approach, and then of course, we will be able to try to align with these kind of social linguistic and strategic communicative competencies. That's what we are trying to do at the moment at our university.
Okay, and Jyotsna, does that resonate?
It does resonate. I agree with her a lot. Yes, I was just thinking that any assessment needs to be collaborative. You need to make sure that different parts of the competence is assessed in a single activity. So I would try a simulation, for example, where I'm able to assess all of this, how they work under pressure, how are they with customers, how are they able to influence, and all of that, just an example, right? So I'd probably hold a simulation, and we can do it at scale as well. So manage that. The only challenge that I see is assessor capability in terms of doing this, and standardization in terms of doing these. So if you're looking at that from that perspective, yes, collaborative activities and tasks are a better bet than just language-based training. A combination of the two will help.
Sure. So a lot of training for, higher education teachers in terms of assessment literacy, and to be able to design reliable, valid assessments, even if they're not high stakes, but even if they are for formative use in the classroom, that would be helpful. But these days, AI is everywhere. So Richard, this one's for you. Can AI-based assessment systems capture authentic communicative ability? And if there are any ethical or validity risks in automated communication assessment?
Well, they can partly, I think. So one of the problems that we have if we're doing kind of like scenario-based assessments is that it's very subjective. Marking them is quite difficult. Standardization and things like that is very hard. So AI can help us with that. I'm actually working on something at the moment where we're building a kind of AI based scenarios where people are taken through a kind of workplace scenario and they have to kind of negotiate their way through. So this is something that we're working on actively. It's not perfect, that's for sure. I think it's useful. It's more objective. It could be good for with high numbers of people, because as we know, if anything where you're talking about scenario-based or performance-based, it takes a lot of effort and a lot of resources. And you've got to train the people to conduct it, etc. You just cannot do it at high numbers. So you need some way to screen people, which is why, you know, we have the other types of tests as well to do an initial kind of like, okay, we will take this out of 1,000 people, we will take, you know, these
Some kind
20
of a sense
people.
check.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, a sense check. And then we think, you know, we can maybe observe these people more carefully and do something in more detail. So it's impossible to give everybody these kind of scenario-based tests. It's just, we just can't do it. So AI can help us with that. Again, yeah, we all know AI, you know, kind of hallucinates and things like that. So it does come with risks. It comes with risks about fairness. If the AI is responding in real time, is everybody going to get the same kind of experience? You know, if AI decides to, you know, ask some strange questions, you know, how are we going to kind of assess that? So there's a lot of potential there, but we're still finding out exactly how useful it is. I think it is useful, but let's not put everything into AI right now, I would say.
Yeah, so that's useful because, I mean, I remember attending a session where some two researchers from Reading and one other university, I forget, and they talked about the task was all of us go to different AI, you know, engines and ask them to assess your speaking ability. 3 of them gave different levels. One used the CEFR, one used the IELTS band descriptors, and there was no my ability is the same, so everybody should tell me I'm a B1 speaker or whatever my ability is, let's say. But there were different responses. So yes, I agree with you.
It sounds easy to do something like that, but in reality, when you try and do it, it's actually quite tricky.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So we've touched a bit on what the landscape is, how different assessments are used for different purposes. Then we possibly are assessing different constructs or different aspects of communicative competence, and coming together is possible, but it cannot be done by one sector in isolation. Everybody has to work together, more dialogue between higher education and academia, maybe employers, highlighting what are the exact skills they need from the candidate in the job advert, making it more explicit rather than, you know, excellent communication skills. So it's really, really interesting and useful to have this conversation. And thank you for bringing your expertise to the session and having this really meaningful discussion. And now I'd like to open the floor for the audience to ask us any questions that they have posted. Let me see. It's not loading up. That's good. Okay. Okay. So Jennifer Jenkins is asking, is it time to say goodbye to any kind of standardized tests altogether? Richard, this one's for you.
I think this one must be for me, yes. I will thank you very much, Jennifer, for that question. I would say no. That's the short answer. But we do need to diversify. Standardized tests do serve a purpose. and we do need them, I think, still, but we need to build on those, and we need to know that they only tell us part of the story, and they're quite restricted in what they can say, and especially if you're thinking about an international workplace as well, where people are using communication skills and they come from all different backgrounds, places. We do need to kind of progress from our kind of traditional view of standardized testing, I think, and actually to make it, I think standardized testing can adapt and can become more communicative and more inclusive in many ways. And that's something that I'm trying to work on, but I still think it does have a purpose.
So when it's a follow-up based on what you said. So we have IELTS, we have TOEFL, we have so many of these other tests, they've been there for years and traditional. And do you think it's time for those tests to maybe adapt to become AI-based, more scenario-based? Is that the way forward? Maybe, I don't know. What do you think?
It's a good question. I think that's something that we need to be looking at, and we need to make tests more adaptable and maybe more kind of customized and localized. It's something that I kind of strongly believe in. Yeah, we have IELTS and TOEFL. You know, they do assess some of the underlying skills, but you could still, you know, as we know, you can still get a good grade in IELTS and, you know, you won't be ready for the workplace.
I have a comment
even though,
about that,
yeah,
but I will refrain from making that. Okay, there's another question from Denelson Souza. The question is, to what extent do you believe that interactional competence could be assessed through the use of interactive avatars programmed in a way it can probe into that competence, later analyzed by human, of course? So in other words, first check with AI and then later validated by a human rater, maybe. Is it possible?
The thing is that AI does have some limitations. So the AI that we're working with at the moment, it's not, we're actually doing investigations of this at the moment, and it covers some aspects of interaction, but it's not very good at covering others. And some of those other things are quite important. So there are some AI models which can kind of interrupt you, and you can interrupt them, but they're not used very much at the moment because they're quite unpredictable.
Okay.
So the model that we use, for example, is a little bit calmer, but it means that, you know, there's a little bit of a gap between people speaking, which means, again, it's still quite predictable in some ways. So it's a bit more like question answer, so a bit more like an interview sometimes. So the AI at the moment does have limitations. It is going to get better. But I don't think at the moment it assesses all types of interaction, and certainly potentially misses some of the things which are important.
Okay.
I just have a wild thought here. I thought I should add part of.
Sure.
So I completely agree with Richard in terms of what AI can do and cannot do. But I think AI is a very good coach when it comes to certain things. So I would say if I were to go for an interview and I have a job description in hand, whatever it is, right? I would probably put that into a ChatGPT or any other AI possible, and then say, what kind of communication skills are expected for me to be able to handle this job? What kind of questions can I expect during the interview? How do I frame these questions? Answer these questions, right? I would probably do something like that. This is, again, just something that came up right now, but something that we can do, because I have found personally also that AI is a good coach when you're looking at things like that. So in that sense, I think AI is good. It at least helps you do the right things if you're given the right prompts. Prompts are very important with AI. So if you do that, I think it'll definitely help there. And also In organizations, of course, I'm not talking about recruitment, but after you recruited and when you're talking about on-the-job training and things like that, AI can definitely help with a lot of coaching when it comes to language and other things, because by then you know your job, you're able to give it the right prompts, understand what you need to do. So we have a coaching bot that actually gives you different scenarios and then expects you to answer them, and then it kind of rates you on whether you could have been a little more empathetic here and things like that. But I think that's the next level. But from that perspective, I think it's possible, but absolutely with Richard otherwise.
Okay, so with that, we will come to a close. And thank you so much, especially to the panelists here for taking the time and coming and having this discussion, to the audience who's joined from around the world. Before we go, I'd like you to answer one question. That is, if your institution or organization made one change from our discussion today, you can be as imaginative, creative as you like, what would that be? And we'll also share the feedback survey in the chat. Please spend 2 minutes completing that. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and we'll see you in a little bit with a third session for the series. Thank you.